Today, I'm introducing a study that we did with data that was collected by the Water Integrity Network in Bangladesh that I think answers some of these questions quite nicely. So why do we actually, or why should we focus on sextortion and WASH? We know that WASH access is highly gendered, and women face an increased risk of violence when access is not guaranteed, right? But we still don't know enough about where and when this violence takes place. And of course, there are different types of violence that individuals face. In this study, we interviewed and surveyed only women, but of course we know that men and LGBTIQ individuals are likely also affected. But just as a kind of word of caution, this study focuses on women only. And if you could go to the next slide. Just a little bit of background. It was a data set this was collected by WIN and 2 local partners. The data was collected in Bangladesh in 2 rural areas and 2 urban slums that all have a certain level of water insecurity. It was a survey with 1,200 women, so it's quite a large survey for a question like this, and then some key informant interviews and focus groups. So just to give you a background where the data comes from. I would say, if we go to the next slide, so we asked kind of 3 questions, right? We were interested in where does sextortion happen, what factors make women especially vulnerable. And, you know, as I'm telling you that what we found, probably none of this sounds that surprising if we think about where we expect sextortion to happen. And this is kind of what we expect, but there's still very few studies that explore this in more detail, who is vulnerable and why, and also, you know, where in the water sector. So there have been 2 studies done until now, but so we wanted to add something in a different part of the world. So we did find that sextortion occurs throughout accessing WASH, particularly when we access to water, a little bit in access to bathing facilities, and a little bit in accessing toilets. But access to water was really the main area where sextortion happened. If we go, I keep forgetting that you need to move the slide. So if we go to the next slide, where I think this study really adds kind of to existing research and to our understanding. A lot is looking at what factors make women more vulnerable to sextortion. So again, we found that poverty makes women much more vulnerable. Not surprising, right? As Nancy also discussed, you know, if you don't have money or goods to pay the bribe with, then your body is all that is left. But again, having kind of the data that shows this, of course, especially for policymakers who we know like to see numbers, is really important. And for the study, we used the Lived Poverty Index, where we basically used a measure of deprivation of basic necessities as a proxy for poverty at the household level. And we clearly saw that, you know, those households that are poorer and women are more exposed to sextortion. The next thing that we found is about water insecurity. And this is, again, not surprising when we know, okay, in access to water, there's more sextortion. So if you don't have secure access to water, if your household is not, you know, doesn't have a pipe directly into the household, but also if water is scarce and, you know, doesn't get delivered regularly, then you're more exposed to sextortion. What was really interesting here, and this gets me back to the question Alana just asked about, you know, should we research sextortion just as a part of sexual and gender-based violence? We found that for women across all the areas faced sexual and gender-based violence when accessing water and sanitation services. However, and you know, the likelihood of being exposed to sexual and gender-based violence was roughly the same across all areas. But women in water insecure households had a a much higher risk of being exposed to sextortion, right? So this for me is a big finding saying, yes, lots of the reason why women are vulnerable to sextortion are similar to why they are vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence, but they're not always the same. And that's why it's important to research them also as a separate thing, right? To have sextortion as a separate concept. The next thing that we found is that lack of literacy plays a big role. So women who are not literate or just barely literate are exposed more to sextortion, which again, if we think about it, is not that surprising because they can't, they often don't know their rights. They might not be able to read signs of what they're entitled to, all of these things, right? And then last, the role of gender norms that really played a big role on different levels, right? So we have gender roles determine, who can be a victim because of, say, household tasks, right? Women are more often responsible for getting water for the household. Therefore, they're more exposed to corruption, including sextortion in that sector. It also determines who is a potential perpetrator and how are the perpetrators treated by society. It determines how are the victims treated by society. Shame and stigma that is attached to any kind of sexual violence is of course huge in every country, but are there support services and what are the results of the shame and stigma are again very much determined on local norms. So we found that this is really plays a huge role both in determining who is vulnerable, but then also seeing, does that form of corruption get reported, and is it taken seriously as a form of corruption that needs to be punished, right? So this was where gender norms really play a huge role. So just to the next slide, and sorry, I know it was a bit long. We already talked about this, and Nancy already mentioned it. So where I think the big thing is really that we need more data collection, both about the sectors, the locations of where exactly it happens, and of course of who is affected. So we know women are not a homogeneous group, but we also know that men, LGBTQI individuals, all of there are different groups that are affected by sextortion. And so for me, the big thing that I see that is still missing is more and more data collection. So thank you very much.
Wonderful.